All right, I'm going to say hello, and my name is Brad Cruz. I'm the Associate Vice President of Alumni Relations at Case Western Reserve University. Great to have you all here. This is our second ever Page Turners. We appreciate your patience as we start learning through this. It's a great opportunity for us. Page Turners is done in conjunction with Think Forum. So when Think Forum authors are on campus, we'll do a Page Turners beforehand to actually talk about the book, bringing in some faculty. So today it's about Valerie Jarrett and her book about her time in the White House, her life and her time in the White House. And the Think Forum, which is also MLK Convocation, is Friday, January the 24th at 12:45 p.m. If you're in the Cleveland area, we invite you to join us on campus. It'll be in the Tink Ballroom. A couple of other little housekeeping notes. Everyone is muted by default. And also, we'll come to a time where we'll look for questions. So if you'll use your icon that says, that has the hand, myself or Katie O'Malley will call on you to ask your question. Karen will take the question, and the professor there will also respond. So that's how we'll work that. And one last thing, I always think this is interesting. If you will put in the chat where you are and also the temperature. So that's me. I'm in Lakewood, Ohio, and it's 2 degrees here. So with that said, I'm turning it over to somebody sitting near the fire, I hope, and that's Karen Kaler. Karen, it's all yours.
Hello, welcome everyone. We're so glad you're here, and we actually do have a fire going. Very unusual for us, but we've got a fire going here in the library at Harcourt House. I'm so glad you're all here, and I'm very glad to have Matthew Lacombe here with us today. Matthew is the Alexander Lamas Associate Professor in U.S. Politics in the Department of Political Science at Case Western Reserve University. While in grad school, he co-authored the book Billionaires and Stealth Politics. Now, we're not going to talk about, say, Elon Musk today, but will note that Professor Lacombe's research interests have become more topical as time has passed. In 2021, his book, Firepower, How the NRA Turned Gun Owners into a Political Force, was published. I think Firepower is a great title. It's also a fascinating topic.
Thank you.
And I know you have written extensively about other topics. Could you just tell us a little about some of your interest?
Sure. So the broad unifying theme of my research is really on how groups and organizations in American politics find ways to build political power and exercise it. So I've looked at organized billionaires. I've looked at organizations like the National Rifle Association, and I'm now currently looking at how other groups have built alliances at particular points in U.S. history that have enabled them to sort of gain political voice in unexpected ways. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Yeah.
No, it's
thanks for having
fascinating.
me.
It's fascinating. I'm glad you could be here. And I expect that some of you with us here out in Zoom land have read the book and others have not, which is just fine. But we are going to, when we ask questions or ask you if you want to have comments or questions, we're going to put your hand up, and we're not going to call on you right away, but just leave your hand up because we don't want those awkward silences while we're waiting to see if any of you might say something or not. So keep raising your hand to participate. Now, the book, Finding My Voice When the Perfect Plan Crumbles, The Adventure Begins, is a memoir of Valerie Jarrett. She's best known as the longest-serving senior advisor to President Barack Obama. And Obama is elected almost precisely halfway through the book. So to me, there's a separation there. So I think we might think about if you have any questions or comments about this, but any meaningful moments from the first half of the book, things that really resonated with you. And Matt, would you go first with that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So something that struck a chord for me in the first half of the book, beyond just the sort of fascinating upbringing that Valerie Jarrett had, is the challenges she confronted around the time when she had her daughter. My wife and I had a baby this past September, and it's been a wonderful gift and a lot of fun so far. But we're both now back to work and are confronting the sort of similar set of challenges that are associated with trying to sort of quote unquote have it all. We both work full-time jobs. We both like to exercise. We both like to eat healthy, and we both like to ideally be good parents. And on some days, it feels like there isn't time for each of those distinct tasks. And so hearing someone as successful as Valerie Jarrett talk through those challenges and talk through how she sort of confronted them and ultimately, obviously, succeeded professionally to a substantial degree while also being a terrific mom was something that was meaningful to me at this stage of my life. Yeah.
Yeah. So, a thing that really struck me was Valerie Jarrett and I were both born in November of 1956. She's 2 weeks older than I am. So through it all, it was like she was at the same age at the same time that I was. And so we had similar experiences, and there were reminders of how things have changed for the better. One, you're mentioning the baby. She says in the epilogue, now the paperback, which I read, has an epilogue, and it was published in 2020. Matt read the hardback, so you didn't have this epilogue. The epilogue is mostly, you would think, the moment in politics. It's about having her grandson. So she writes like her hopes and dreams for her grandson and what it's like to have a grandson. But she talks about the parenting style. She said, my parents spoke with one voice, my mother's. And she said she herself, with her husband returned to work the day Laura was born. Whereas her son-in-law is much more involved. And I am now a grandmother. Both of my sons have a daughter, and both of them had paternity leave, which is wonderful. When our first son was born, I didn't get maternity leave.
Wow.
So I got a different job. So when our second son was born, I got maternity leave for 6 weeks, but my husband was so pleased that I managed to have the baby over the weekend, so he didn't miss a moment of work. So, yeah. Another thing that reminded me of these differences is when Valerie first met Michelle Obama. Now, Michelle is 7 years younger than us. And she was talking about how impressed she was with this young woman, and she wants to offer her a job. And she said, so she checked in with Michelle, and she got right to the point. She had talked it over with her fiance and had some serious reservations. And she was like, who the hell is your fiance? I blurted out. And why do we care what he thinks? So with a disarming laugh, she said his name is Barack Obama, and he thinks the mayor's office could be a dangerous place to work. We're a team, and we make all big life decisions together. Now, I understood both of their points. Of course, you make your life decisions together, and I would have, of course, asked my fiance or husband about such things, but I wouldn't have admitted it. I mean, Valerie and I would both be in the thing that, of course, it only makes sense that you would talk to your life partner about a major decision, but as we were coming up, it was not really acceptable to talk like that you would ask a man.
Those shifts are interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
And on your first point, I should plug, I'm fortunate to work at Case Western Reserve, and I had plenty of parental leave. In fact, more than my wife did.
That's really nice.
I was able to spend some good time with Isabel, our daughter.
Isabel. Yeah. Okay. Now, all of you out there, who had a question or comment? Anything from the first half of the book?
Let's see. Do we have any comments? Does anybody have a question? Does anybody want to put their hand up? If not, I may ask a question. So, all right, I'll get the ball rolling. So, let me go. So the question I have is about Valerie was the longest serving senior advisor to President Obama. And I wonder, Matt, if I can call you Matt, what do you think what do you think was would you attribute to her serving longer?
Well,
Do you have any thoughts on that?
yeah, a few things come to mind. One, and I'll put in a plug for the book if we have audience members who are listening to the conversation but haven't read it yet. If you decide to engage with it, don't skip ahead to the part where they're all in the White House. That's a great part of the book, but Valerie Jarrett lived a fascinating life. Her early years were spent in Iran. And I bring this up at this point because I think part of why she had formed such a deep bond with the Obamas is that she had a similar early life experience to Barack Obama in a lot of important ways. Experiencing race in America, but also having more of an international lens, and also having family members who either were or sort of passed for white. These are all things she talks about early in the book, and I suspect is part of why she formed such a tight bond with Obama. Beyond that, I think she's sort of fiercely loyal to the Obamas and extremely competent, all of which typically would provide staying power in something like a presidential administration.
Yeah, yeah. I think their friendship too. I mean, that, and what you're talking about, this shared background. I mean, and Obama's parents met when they were getting their PhDs, so they were highly educated people. Valerie has a similarly very elite background. Her great grandfather was, I think it's, she said, the first America's first accredited Black architect. Now, I'm going to put in a plug for another book, Robert Madison, Designing Victory. Robert Madison was the first African American in the state of Ohio to get an architecture degree, which he got from Case Western Reserve University, and he is still with us at 101.
Wow.
So anyway, so that really struck me that they had and Valerie's father was a doctor. Why they were in Iran is that he was couldn't get a job paying as well in America as white doctors did. So he went to Iran to practice medicine.
I think in general that's a fascinating part of the book. Valerie is very open and honest and vulnerable, and she simultaneously talks about the affluence she experienced in some ways, but combined with the realities of race in the U.S., especially during the period of her upbringing. And it was all very fascinating to hear about. She had this terrific community in Chicago that ended up overlapping with the Obama's community of prominent Black Americans who were very impressive, but nonetheless not always treated by society as such.
Yeah. So, yeah, how about the second half of the book? Okay, now y'all out there in Zoom land, think of it if you have questions or comments that deal more with the political part in the second half of the book. So, anything that struck you?
Well, one thing that struck me, and there's plenty to talk about during Valerie's years in the Obama White House. On a personal level, one thing that struck me was that she seemed to take the opportunity to sort of stop and smell the roses from time to time. She talks about the views that you can get looking out of Marine One in Washington, D.C. that you might not get from a commercial airplane or even from Air Force One. She talks about the wonderful travel that they were able to engage in. And she talks about informing folks who were given awards by President Obama of being the person to deliver that news, including people like Michael Jordan, who didn't initially believe the call was real. So sort of fascinating anecdotes that I think show a really interesting outlook and perspective on the job.
Yeah. My husband always says that that's one of his favorite things is when he gets to tell someone they've won a university award. Yeah. It's just like, it's so fun to get to share that with someone. One thing that really struck me, she had been the deputy chief of staff to Mayor Daley in Chicago. And then while she was a senior advisor, not a chief of staff, it was similar to the role. And seeing their dedication the staff members' dedication to the president and to the country, and how they're so, patriotic, caring for our country. And I was really reminded of the staff people that I know at the university. At Case Western Reserve University, the staff are so dedicated. And, I knew that from, when my husband was first chairman of chemical engineering, where he had been a professor at Delaware, seeing how, that's when I really got to know the people on the staff. And they were so dedicated to the department and the university. Whereas, my husband was very dedicated to his students and to his research, but to see their depth of care for the whole university was, and I saw that too in the book. It was.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
We do have a question. I am going to turn it over to Krista. And Krista, if you will just unmute yourself, and you've got the floor. So take it away, or the screen, maybe.
Yeah, it's not really a question, but before we went into the political part of when she's in the White House, I really was interested in what she talked about. Her grandfather, I think, was trying to do mixed income housing sort of stuff in Chicago. And ironically, like, things didn't go his way. And after he died, they built a project, which is not mixed income housing, but all the poor people together. And they named it after her grandfather. And they had really mixed feelings about that. But I was particularly interested in knowing that part of the book where she talks about changing the economics in Chicago, because in Cleveland are just tearing down these one of the biggest projects I think in the U.S. that was built in the 40s, which was just for poor people, and we're starting to build mixed income housing. And I wish I could pick her brain on how they made that successful, and because it's still sort of we're just doing that now here in Cleveland.
Yeah.
Where is that, the area that's being torn down?
It's down Buckeye. Is it Buckeye or no? It's down Woodland, on Woodland. If you go Larchmere all the way down towards downtown on Woodland.
Okay.
Just a massive, well, it was a massive complex. They've torn it down.
Yeah.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have any?
Well, the topic of public housing and segregation within cities is a fascinating, important, and somewhat dark topic.
Yeah.
Truthfully, and although Cleveland has its struggles, I'm actually not sure that Chicago is a shining case study on how to nail that balance. Given that Chicago, I've lived in Chicago, I love it, but it is certainly a very segregated city, and I think Cleveland has confronted similar challenges, and it does seem like we're now on a potentially better path forward in terms of trying to build affordable housing, but also mixed income housing, and to try and bring together more and more parts of Cleveland into a sort of single community.
Yeah.
But it's tough. This isn't really what I study, but as a resident of Cleveland, I observe some parts of the city getting a lot more investment and reinvestment than others, and we want to balance economic development in areas that are thriving with investing in areas that aren't doing so well, so that they may start to head in the right direction. And I don't know that anyone has the answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have another question just from the questions that we had that we went through. And one is, for the both of you, what did you find most surprising in this book? What was something that you were like, I had no idea this is, or just something that was like maybe a light bulb moment or something? I'll give it back to you.
Do you want to go first?
You know what? I actually marked this thing. I remember when Michelle Obama was, she's talking about when Michelle gave a speech, and I think it's when she said she was really proud of our country. And people were saying, like, weren't you before? And that she came to him, I mean, she said she had tears in her eyes. She was so upset. And she said, she turned to us and said, why didn't you tell me? And she was right. They had loved how she was so candid and refreshing in her heartfelt delivery, and nobody thought that she needed training and checking so she didn't say the right thing. And I think I have been in the role of partner to a president. It's a much smaller scale, but I know I have a lot of friends through different associations who are partners to presidents. And we sort of feel like we're sometimes out there and you might say something wrong and get in trouble, but nobody tells you. Yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah. And she also, on that same page, she talks about that it took us a long time, too long, to realize that by not calling out the lies and nipping them in the bud, we allowed them to gain traction. And I've had that same frustration. Like, a lot of people think, well, you don't pay it, you ignore lies.
Yeah.
And I think probably Michelle was saying, no, you gotta call them out.
Yeah.
So I think to see that she had some of the same concerns that I had was a surprise to me.
Those are great insights. One thing that stood out to me, and I'm not sure if it's surprising so much as interesting, and I hadn't read sort of insider insights into it before engaging with this book. It was related to how the Obama campaign, especially during their first run at it in 2008, navigated the topic of race. The fact that if elected, Barack Obama would become the United States' first Black president. There was sort of open and I think honest and genuine debate within the campaign about the degree to which that's a topic that they should truthfully avoid versus leaning into. And I think I would have expected them to have had a sort of grand strategy and plan related to that going into the campaign. And I'm not. I don't want to make it seem like Jarrett claims that they were sort of making it up as they went along, because that isn't exactly true. But they were sort of pivoting as they reacted to new situations, as they learned from one another and learned from constituents and voters who they interacted with. And ultimately they ran a successful campaign, so it seemed to work out. But her discussion of it was fascinating. Just this balance between wanting to provide representation to a part of the United States that hadn't previously seen representation on this level, versus also win a campaign in a country where talking about these things isn't always the most popular approach.
Yeah. And well, Hillary Clinton, it was glass ceiling, we're going to have a woman president. But it seemed that Kamala Harris actually had we're not going to talk about this. We're not going to talk about, and that seemed like an absolute strategy.
That struck me as well.
So?
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we'll debate endlessly about whether that was the correct approach or the incorrect approach. And the thing that's difficult about any political campaign, but especially presidential campaigns, that there are a few dozen factors that influence the outcome in a given year, and folks like to sort of pile on and identify their favorite explanation and run with it. I'm not sure that is what sort of swung the election one way
Is
or
not
the other.
talking about it?
Is not talking about
Well,
it. I think there might be an argument to be made that talking about it could have been helpful, but it's hard to,
But you know what? There are those that think perhaps a woman can't be elected in the United States as well.
Well, and I think it's a tricky balance, especially for folks from groups or demographics that have historically lacked representation, or not held particular positions of influence, such as the presidency. It's trying to seem genuine on the one hand, versus professional on the other hand, and trying to talk about things in a sort of personal way, without making a lot of folks feel sort of uncomfortable. And I think that that's something that President Obama seemed to have done particularly well during his campaigns, but that I think has, was a challenge for both Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris. And that isn't really a critique of them so much as an observation of
Right, right.
the difficulty there.
Right, right.
When Valerie Jarrett, for example, talks about moments in which President Obama showed emotion. There were a few times in his presidency in which he broke down into tears. And those were humanizing moments for him. I mean, I remember when they occurred, they were generally received well. I think when it comes to the topic of gender, though, showing that sort of emotion would quite possibly be received differently.
I mean, didn't Hillary show tears
Right.
once, and it was really
A scandal. Yeah.
a scandal? Yeah. Now, if there's not another question from the audience, I have a question, Matt, that I would love for you to speak to. Speaking of tears, the one point in the book where I just really teared up was at Sandy Hook. Sandy Hook. And since, you have done research on the NRA, and Sandy Hook is a time that we thought, I don't know, I read a lot of history, and I think, what are we doing right now that, we look back and think, how in the world do people justify their behavior on many topics, but, particularly that slavery. How did people do that? And I think 100 years from now, won't our descendants be saying, you let little children get shot? That's who my great-great-grandmother was. Did she, why did they not stop that? So,
yeah. So, just to remind anyone in the audience, a lot of my research has looked at the gun debate, and so I've written about the NRA and how it's exerted political influence. The NRA was highly relevant to the gun control debate that played out in 2013 following the Sandy Hook shooting. That was a moment. So and I'll try not to be too long-winded on this, although of course I could talk forever, given that this is something I've thought a lot about. But President Obama always was on record as being supportive of gun regulation, but during his first term, it was an issue that he chose to deprioritize. Among all the things that he could try and do something about, he decided to be somewhat hands-off on the gun issue, and there are a number of reasons for that. That shifted when Sandy Hook occurred, I think, because it affected him personally. It affected the country in a really deep way, and it seemed like maybe it had ushered in a new political moment within the gun debate. Ultimately, however, the piece of legislation that was put together, the Manchin-Toomey bill, it was called, did not succeed. It had to overcome a filibuster in the Senate, although I believe it received 54 votes. It needed 60 to overcome that filibuster, and it didn't make it. And part of why I bring up the names involved in that bill is that it was notable because it was co-sponsored by Joe Manchin, who is a Democrat from West Virginia, just left office, and was the most conservative Democrat in Congress by a fairly wide margin, along with Pat Toomey, a Republican from Pennsylvania. So the Obama administration sort of went out of their way to encourage two people particularly well positioned to do something on this issue to sponsor the bill. And the bill itself was very moderate. It would have expanded background checks, but also given away some goodies to the gun lobby, some things that they had been looking to change for a long time as a sort of compromise measure. And yet, despite all of that, the lobbying from the NRA and other gun rights groups was too much to overcome. The bill did not make it through the Senate, and even if it had, at that point in the Obama years, the House of Representatives was under Republican control. So I don't think it would have passed the House either. So what does that say about gun politics, to sort of get out of the nitty-gritty? On the one hand, I think it was a real low point. I've heard a lot of folks say, if we couldn't get anything done following Sandy Hook, when could we ever get anything done? Could you imagine a worse tragedy? The only thing I'd say, and this is something that Valerie Jarrett talks about in the book, is that Sandy Hook was a moment in which a new sort of gun regulation, gun safety political movement got off the ground. So because that movement was new at the time, it wasn't really able to make a difference in that specific legislative debate. The moment the sort of policy window passed without anything happening at that point in time. But what we see is a huge surge in activism on behalf of gun regulation, gun safety laws in the time since Sandy Hook, which has since then made some difference. States around the country, in many cases, have passed additional regulations on guns. And in 2022, Joe Biden signed into law the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which was the first federal level gun control law in over 30 years. It's not perfect. It's not sufficient. It by itself is not going to, solve this problem, but it's an issue in which many people often feel like there's been sort of no progress made on the gun regulation side, and I don't think that's right. And I think it was the activism of folks affected by Sandy Hook that helped sort of start a movement that 12 years later is still trying to make a difference. So I was happy that Valerie talked not just about the frustration associated with not being able to do anything following Sandy Hook, but also about the bravery and activism of the folks who were affected by that shooting, who rather than just being privately angry, decided to try and make a difference in society.
Yeah, she wrote about that Sandy Hook Promise was started by parents, and very movingly about these parents.
Yeah. It was a powerful part of the book.
Yeah. So, okay, did we have more? Anyone else out there?
So let me ask one. We don't have any more questions, but I'm going to pitch one more to the two of you, and then Karen after that. Do you want to share with us your closing, and then we'll just all right. So let me ask one more question to the two of you, and that question would be, Valerie, so what do you think in terms of as being a senior advisor to the President of the United States? I'm sure there's all kinds of challenging aspects, but now having read the book and learning Valerie's background, is there an area that you think would have been the most challenging for her? And this is, I'm not asking for, that this is for sure and for certain, but what is your just opinion on what you would think a challenging aspect of the job would be for Valerie? And then Karen, you'll take it away after that.
Do you have
So this relates to the last topic we discussed, gun control. I think an aspect that would be frustrating about working in the White House in this sort of contemporary political period marked by very high levels of polarization would be the challenges associated with making things happen. Regardless of which side of the aisle you're from, I think if you arrive in the White House, you're someone who has a strong motivation to make change, to see the vision you have for the world come sort of closer to fruition. And yet we have a political system that sort of frustrates change, and to an even greater degree today because of the high levels of partisanship that exist, and the sort of seemingly large differences that exist between the parties. And that's something that Valerie talked about in the book, her frustration that at times it seemed like Republicans were more interested in sort of harming President Obama and the Democrats politically than in working together, which is something that I'm not sure is exclusive to that time and that situation, which is to say that's a somewhat common theme of our politics these days. And I have to imagine a sort of doer like Valerie Jarrett found that frustrating at times.
Yeah. And, I think in a position of this type, and particularly because she felt like the Obama's big sister, so it's even more exaggerated than typical that advisors and staff people that serve a president or serve under a president are very protective. They want to protect him from all types of danger, not just physical, but from making mistakes. You want to, and the person who's in the role, like she talks about how he had wanted to sing at some point, and she said, "You don't want to sing," and he sang, and it turned out great. And then when he in the South Carolina. After that horrible shooting, how he said, I I think I might need to sing. And she was like, okay, whatever you think. And of course, him singing Amazing Grace was, I think touched the whole nation. But, I think that she probably was even more protective than a typical advisor because of her close personal relationship. And that might have been the hardest. I would think might have been a hard thing for her.
That's a great point. And in fact, there are parts of the book that discussed whether, it would be wise for her to have a position in the White House, given her personal relationship with the Obamas. And I think the sort of historical record, as told by Valerie herself, but also as written by others, suggests that she did a great job and that was a good move. But nonetheless, there had to have been some real sort of emotional and personal challenges associated with holding a professional role like that. When this isn't just your boss, it's your friend.
Your friend. Yeah. And your very close friend's husband.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Very close friends to both. And
all right, Karen, you want to take us home?
okay.
Right, you want to close us out?
Yeah, so I want to close us with how Valerie, with hindsight, ended up closing the book. So she had closed the book previously, and then she wrote the epilogue about her grandson, and she talks about how, the advice that she would like to give him in life, that she wants him to be confidence in his own voice, the ability to listen to everyone else's, especially those with whom he agrees. She goes on to say, I hope he keeps an open mind and an open heart, and instead of closing off from that which is different or difficult, seeks to build connection and understanding. It's through openness and empathy that we build community, one that isn't just about personal gain, but about the common good, because how we treat one another influences the kind of community and country we create. Then she goes on at the very end, she calls this epilogue the path of lightning. And she writes about her own grandmother, who she called Puddin', who was she was so close to her. And I think this is advice she is giving this advice to all of us. She said her grandmother would say, put yourself in the path of lightning. She said she would encourage her to take hard classes rather than ones in her comfort zone. Students have told me that. I learned from, university students. They'll say there's no comfort in the growth zone and there's no growth in the comfort zone. So put yourself out there and take a risk. And she said other times she wanted me to take the heat. Be brave, she'd tell me. Be fearless. Be willing to discover your own resilience after a failure. Be willing to try what you think is impossible, and through sheer effort and a determined spirit, force it to be inevitable. So, here you go, right from Valerie Jarrett. Put yourself in the path of lightning.
All right, very good. Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Katie put in the chat other page turners that are coming up. We're so fortunate to start this new endeavor, and we thank you for participating. Have a great day. Bye-bye.